Welcome everyone to the Challenging Racism in Football Beyond Taking the Knee webinar. We've got lots in store for you tonight. Thanks for joining us. To start us off, I'll just introduce our panel of guests tonight. We've got lots of experience, expertise and knowledge, and I'm certainly looking forward to this discussion myself during the session tonight. The first person that we have as a guest tonight is Piara Powar. Now, Piara is the Executive Director at the Fair Network, and also previously was the Director at Kick It Out as well. So thanks for joining us tonight, Piara.
Thank you, Jason.
Here's Anita Asante. Now, Anita is a professional footballer currently at Aston Villa. She's also an England international, and she's an ambassador for Show Racism, the Red Card. So thanks for joining us as well, Anita.
Yep, thanks for having me, Jason.
And last but not least is Dean Pymble. Now, Dean is the campaign manager at Show Racism, the Red Card in Wales. Previously worked in the Community Foundation at Cardiff City Football Club, and will be joining us as our final last guest for this session tonight. So welcome, Dean.
Thanks, Jace. Good to be here.
Now, this session tonight forms part of our wider PAWB education programme. We're trying to provide more education and workshops and opportunities for individuals working or volunteering or involved in clubs across Wales to upskill themselves, to find out more around equality, diversity, inclusion, but also what role they can play in challenging discrimination within the game. Now, tonight's session also forms part of the Show Racism, the Red Card Month of Action, who are one of our equality partners within Wales. And I just want to hand over to Dean just to talk a little bit around the charity and what the Month of Action is about, and how anyone listening in tonight or any clubs can get involved in the Month of Action.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jason. So the Month of Action, it runs through October and gives opportunity for clubs in Wales to show their support for Show Racism Red Card and hold match day actions as a vehicle to deliver anti-racism message to the community through the power of sport. We know how powerful sport can be, and fantastic role models like we got Anita tonight. So with this, the action weeks take part in October during the season, and it aims to unite supporters, clubs, ethnic minorities and communities affected by discrimination, increases public awareness and tackles discrimination in football. Challenges all forms of discrimination, promotes integrity, values amongst youth, and celebrate the input of all individuals that strive to make football a game for all, regardless of who we are, where we are from, and what our beliefs are. Show Racism Red Cards, we've got a Month of Action where grassroots clubs can sign up. We'll be sending out packs with messages where they can share their message on social media, and the young people can hold their cards up, and adults during their fixture, before their fixture, take some photos and share on social media, just showing their support for our anti-racism message across Wales. I think we've got about 170 clubs signed up so far. If you want any more details, certainly they'll be on the FAW website and on our social media as well. And hopefully, more clubs tonight will get signed up, and we'll hit hopefully 200 clubs in Wales, all supporting the campaign for anti-racist society and football certainly as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Dean. And as Dean mentioned, please get involved in that if you're listening in from a club side, or even as an individual. I think the more people that supports the organisation and some of the core aims in trying to eradicate racism in football, is certainly important. So the format for tonight, basically we'll have a bit of a panel discussion around the topic of challenging racism in football and looking sort of what is beyond taking the knee. But there will be an opportunity for everyone to ask some questions after the panel discussion. So please use the Q&A feature to submit any questions at any point, and we will certainly provide an opportunity to answer those, and for the panelists to answer those at the end of this session. So starting us off, I thought it would be a good way just to sort of, for you guys and our panelists really, to share some of your own experiences of racism within the game. And Anita, maybe come to you first to share some of the experiences that you've had with our listeners.
Yeah, I think I would say I was quite fortunate in the early days of my career as a youngster. I joined Arsenal at the age of 14. And the group of players that I played with were largely diverse, and my club was reflective of the immediate environment. We trained in inner London and Hackney, so there was lots of diverse coaches and people around in the youth setup. So it wasn't really something I was aware of or encountered very much. And I would say it's something that, as I've grown up in general life, that I realized the nuances with racism, because often the focus is on overt racism, whether that be language or, physical threats, chanting and that type of thing. And a lot of the time, as I got older into the professional game, and I think the first time I sort of encountered an incident was between me and another player. And it wasn't because this player was being abrasive and aggressive with the language she was using. She thought she was using it, the N-word, in an endearing way, actually. So it was kind of an ignorant thing, but it showed the differences of culture and understanding and how that would affect me or impact me as an individual. And then I realized, there are these sort of misunderstandings that go on where people don't always recognize the impact of words because of the culture they grow up in and not understanding the historical implications of those things. And then again, in playing in Europe in the Champions League, getting more exposure at the highest level, and being faced with monkey chanting and booing every time we touch the ball, me and another Cameroonian player. And that was the first time I really experienced that. But to be honest, I feel it's weird to say lucky, but quite fortunate that it hasn't been a massive, too many occasions where I've had to face it throughout my career. And I think that's largely because we don't have the same visibility and exposure as the men's game either, across broadcast media and a wider fan base where we might get more exposed to it. And it's important to note that at the highest level, at the elite level, it's still vastly underrepresentative of Black and ethnic minority groups.
Thanks, Anita. Piara, I just wondered your own personal experiences, but also obviously in terms of at the Fair Network, sort of what you're seeing and some of the experiences, particularly in recent times. We've seen obviously the incidents last week that happened across Europe. So just wondered what your experiences with that.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and great to be part of this. I really have a lot of respect for the work you're doing at the FAW and the things you're driving forward. I think it's going to make a real difference to that organisation and to Welsh society. I think for me, I had a lot of experiences actually growing up. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and so my whole childhood was affected by racism. I mean, I think even at that time, I knew what was going on. Even at that time, it was the thing that I feared. Even at that time, I could kind of name it. And we lived in a society then where people like me were literally afraid every day. Because we were hearing stories about firebombs through people's letterboxes, through people's mums, grandparents and other family members being attacked on the street. It was a pretty sort of volatile, pretty difficult time to grow up, I would say. And I would say, actually, if I'm still very close to people I grew up with, obviously my close family, but also some very close friends. And I would say in one way or another, we were all affected by it. If you were a person of colour, you were not untouched. And I think that's a sad reality. So moving on, I guess I've also seen in my kind of professional life, I've seen a lot of things, heard about a lot of things, had a lot of things reported. And I guess people might be interested in a reflection on what goes on in Europe, because I think it's fair to say that the UK has legislation in place, police forces are trained. There's a lot of good things that have happened here. But in Europe, those things are missing. There is still less awareness of anti-racism as a movement, as an entity, what it means. Governments are less aware of what they should be doing. Mainstream language is at the very least unkind, if not sort of outright insulting. So there's a lot of things that go on, and I guess we hear a lot about what happens in Central and Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe sometimes, in places like Spain and Italy. And I think that my reflection is there are very bad things happening, but people are sort of living through them as best they can. And I guess we always focus more in those regions than we do in the UK on the players' experiences, because players will often be recruited from those two big areas now, certain male players, that is, I'm talking about, from those two big areas where people take playing talent, male playing talent, and that is West Africa and Latin America. So, you will find a national team player from Africa playing in 3 or 4 clubs in the Czech Republic. You will find them in the Balkans, in Croatia, Bosnia. You will see them in countries like Slovenia. So all across Europe, wherever you go, people of African heritage have made a mark. And they are often isolated. They are often getting abuse in a way that their teammates don't understand what's going on. Perhaps their teammates are joining in. The club doesn't know how to respond to it. And support for them is often very, very difficult. They just they're sort of lost, I would say. And we hear about the tip of that iceberg. We hear about big incidents that take place. You mentioned, I think, an incident in Prague last week in particular, as a set of 4 incidents that happened on Thursday night. If you were a player of African heritage, or if you are a player of African heritage playing in Prague every week, and you're hearing some of the stuff that goes on, then I think it's a really isolating experience, a really difficult place to live. But people make careers there as well because they have to, right? That is your reality. You just get on with it. You raise kids there if you need to. You bring your family over if you need to. And these are people in many ways that are pioneers, because they are laying roots down in difficult parts of Europe that perhaps don't have colonial histories, so there isn't a support mechanism for them. And we're always in awe of what those people are going through, what those players are going through, and the way they're coping with it. And I guess it shows the resilience of human beings, that when they're in difficult situations, they will persevere, they will try and get through it. And the shame is that they shouldn't have to get through it, but we just have not got to the point yet where every football association across Europe is aware of how they could be protecting people, is aware of some of the things that they need to do. I know Anita is also sort of quite involved with FIFPro, which is the International Players Union, who do quite a lot. But even for FIFPro, I think many of their affiliates in those countries, they're difficult to sort of get across to. It's difficult often to get across the message to them as the people who should be supporting those players. So just a general reflection, I think, kind of on the European picture. And I'm really interested when we get to the kind of the meat of this debate, because I think Europe is one of the places where this has had the taking of the knee has had an incredible impact.
Thanks, Piara. And I think it's interesting, to hear some of your experiences and some of the things you're finding across Europe. And I think sometimes it's easy for the UK, the home nations, to almost kind of divert attention into other areas across Europe, when clearly there are instances that are still happening, at the highest level of the game, but throughout all levels, right down to the grassroots, in Wales, England, Scotland, Ireland, etc. And, coming over to Dean, you're obviously an organisation that predominantly works to educate young children in schools, but obviously have worked with the Football Association for over 10 years now or so. And I just wondered, sort of, obviously your own personal experiences, but, what are you still finding sort of on the ground level within Wales and across the UK with your work?
Well, I think it's some, there's still overt racism happening. So there's still name calling from the terraces, on the pitches, when you're looking at grassroots. I think when we signed up the clubs for the month of action, I think it's around 12-15% of the clubs have said that there's been racial language or racial abuse happening at their club. Not saying that it's their players, but towards their players. So we still see that in 2021. A lot of it is language you see the children using, which isn't coming from a child's mouth. So that obviously it's a learnt behavior. They're not born racist. They're not born with this ideology, or some of the terminology is not kind of language that a child of that age would use. So it's learnt behaviors at home, but also it's can't be what you can't see. So there's a massive underrepresentation of coaches from a Black and Asian and minority ethnic community. And that means that not all players feel comfortable going to a club. And feeling part of their culture as part of being at that football club, which is then moved on as you're going into the elite pathway, that there's less players from, you know, Black or Asian communities who are going to play professional football because they haven't had the opportunity at grassroots to develop at a very young age. I think we're missing out on a huge pool of talent by not always being adaptable and a place where these players feel part of or feel like they're comfortable to take part in a session. I think that's something all grassroots clubs need to look at is how can they make everybody feel included, and certainly make them feel comfortable to come and take part in their clubs. So that's kind of two stages where, you know, we're still seeing overt racism, but then also coaching wise and actually at clubs, can we make sure they're a good place and a positive experience for the young people taking part? Is a positive first experience, they're more likely going to continue playing football into their older life then.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, you know, that feeling of belonging is so important. And I think, you know, while you look at players at the top levels, you know, is around 33% from sort of Black communities. You know, there's representation there, but it's not necessarily then, you know, reflected in the boardrooms and other senior positions, etc. And I think there are people, you know, particularly at grassroots levels, who for me are massive role models within their own communities. And, you know, we're certainly trying to sort of have a real focus on you know, making sure those people are visible, you know, within the game, and seeing football as an opportunity for a career, you know, in terms of the governance side of the game, and not just focusing on coaching or playing, for example. And I think that's really important, that the environment that clubs themselves and we're trying to create is one that is inclusive for everyone, but not only inclusive, so people are having the opportunities, they're getting selected, they're getting coaching roles, etc. But it's when you're in that environment, you know, do you really feel like you belong and can be your true, authentic self, and kind of your ethnicity, for example, you know, doesn't matter. And you know, we've got a long way to go for that, but I think that's definitely the aim of what we're trying to achieve with this. And I think it's been interesting that, you know, in over the last 18 months or so, following the tragic death of George Floyd, and seeing the players and many players taking the knee for some time now, and Anita, you know, you've yourself and obviously against opposition players have been united in doing that. And I just wondered, sort of, you know, within the game then, you know, what impact do you think that has had, or have you seen or felt yourself that has had? Has it had an impact? If it has, what has it been? Just wondered your thoughts on that, really. You're on mute, Anita.
Just unmute myself. Typical, that is. Yeah. No, but I guess for me, I do think it's been impactful because, you know, I was once a youngster watching senior players at the highest level as my role models, you know, and seeing them take a stand and you know, stand for an issue, a social issue, by the symbolic gesture of taking the knee, I think would have had a lot of impact on me as a young person, you know, trying to navigate life in general, aside from sport. So in that regard, I think it's really powerful, the message, to see that kind of solidarity among clubs and players, staff, not just here, but, you know, globally. And I think that's the reach that taking the knee has had. It's managed to keep this discussion, I think, ongoing. We know we're nowhere near where we want to be, but everyone who's willing to have these discussions and try and progress it further and try to build and bridge that understanding, for me, I think it's important. It doesn't matter how long we do it for, you know, as far as I'm concerned, because, you know, it's also about a peaceful way to protest, and a peaceful way in which we own how we want to demonstrate that gesture. Because I've heard a lot of chat as well about they shouldn't do it this way, they should do it another way. And for me, that's disempowering the people that are standing for something that means something to them, that affects them, affects their communities, their families and friends, and not just for right now, for generations. You know, because taking the knee, although we've known it's sort of started, or, you know, I wouldn't even say started, it started way before, in like the 1700s, when slavery existed and beyond, till Colin Kaepernick, in 2016, taking the knee and has been revived again. It's shown that it's been a useful way to galvanize people historically over time. And again, we're just, grabbing hold to that message again and trying to show that, we have made progress in a lot of areas, but we've still got a long way to go.
Piara, you shared sort of, the experiences as an organisation and personally that you've seen within the game. And I think, for many years, we've seen an incident happen, whether that be in the Premier League or the Premier or across Europe, the Champions League, and it's all over the news and on sort of the media channels for 2-3 days if we're lucky, and it's sort of forgotten about, and then the cycle sort of repeats itself. It certainly feels that over the last 18 months that, as Anita, you said, with potentially the taking the knee and the players doing it week in, week out, there has been a shift where it is kept the issue at the forefront of people's minds. And, I wonder whether, have you seen that as an organisation, that there is a shift and it's more of a focus on trying to find solutions and moving forward than just having that cycle sort of constantly repeated?
Yeah, good question. I think actually that our biggest observation is the way in which, firstly, the players that are taking the knee in the Premier League in England every week, the impact that that's had through the ripple effect globally. The Premier League makes a lot of its global reach. The number of countries where their rights are available, the media rights are available. I think they say they have an audience of 2 billion every week if you include, the big rights countries. And so all of them are watching those players taking the knee, the beginning of the game, of every match. And I think that's been a kind of a significant global symbol in a way that I couldn't have imagined happening even 2 years ago. I have something of an insight into the dynamics of how it came about, but one would not have thought that it would have been something that we would have seen at the beginning of every Premier League match. So I think first and foremost, just to see that symbolism there has been really very important. And I think everybody's clear about what it stands for, what it means. It's both about football itself, but also the wider society, and not just the society in England, not just British society, but globally. And then I think for us, it's also been interesting seeing the dynamics in Europe. A few weeks ago, Zenit St. Petersburg played Chelsea, I think, in the Champions League. The Chelsea players took the knee. And when that happens, you see a lot of the European clubs, they just stand there and they will either just touch the no racism badge on their arm, or they will just stand there respectfully. And what we saw there was that the players of African heritage playing for Zenit St. Petersburg joined the Chelsea players in taking the knee. The white players didn't, but the black players did. And in many ways, it was kind of interesting because you could see that Chelsea taking the knee in that way was a form of empowerment for those players of African heritage playing for Zenit. But at the same time, you also then see that split as the gesture is being debated across Europe. In a lot of countries across Europe, people are very divided about what it means. Many people say, look, we do not have many black people in our country. Why should we take the knee? Why should we have to see people taking the knee when it's not relevant to us? You see governments that are involved in what you might call political culture wars in Hungary, Poland, countries like that, where the government's prime ministers, foreign ministers get involved and make statements about it. So it's interesting seeing that debate. And because that debate's happening, because people are aware that it's happening, and the more that say the Hungarian foreign minister says, we don't want players to come to our country and do it when they play against our team, the more significant you can see the gesture is, because it's creating those debates. And when people don't like it, they at least are thinking about what's happening, right? And we shouldn't forget actually that this gesture, which Anita's right, started off by Colin Kaepernick in the modern era picking it up and taking the knee while the American anthem was being sung, has now transported itself across the world. I know untouchable groups in India, for example, the Dalits, who are marginalized because of caste, and they follow the Black Lives Matter movement because they draw inspiration from it for their own struggles. And you can see that, you know, the same thing is happening around the world through people watching the Premier League players doing it. And that's not something I think I would have envisaged on a very sort of big, impactful anti-racism statement a few years ago. So for me, the impact of it is huge. The fact that it happened, as I say, is incredible. And I would argue that players should keep doing it for as long as they can. I would imagine, and I think this is where these debates are really important, I imagine that at the end of this season, the Premier League might say, look, we've done this now for 1.5 seasons. What do we do now? Do we embed it permanently on somewhere on kits? How do we replace it with a campaign? How do we replace it with other action? And I think that's why these sort of debates are important, because we need to be talking about what that replacement action is. Now, personally, I like to see players being allowed to take the knee forever, but I don't think it's going to happen. You already see a fracturing of that. Some players saying it's just a gesture, I don't want to do it anymore. Others, including white players, saying I respect it, but I don't want to do it. So we do need to be clear about what should replace it. And I think that's why we're here, right? To try and look at that sort of stuff. The only other thing I would say is that it's also led a lot of governing bodies at a national level and international level to think about how they deal with this stuff. Because I remember when, just after the first lockdown, the Bundesliga, the men's Bundesliga, was the first league to come back. And actually the women's Bundesliga followed, because it was one of the first women's leagues in Europe that did come back. Many of them just were sort of put on ice. And there were players that began to take it. I think Jadon Sancho was then at Dortmund. There were a couple of Turkish players who took it. And suddenly the German FA, I don't think I'm giving away any confidences here, were making requests to FIFA to say, how do we deal with this? Because this is a political gesture. And FIFA decided to say, look, it's for someone's human rights. We respect it. We don't believe that football associations should be sanctioning it or acting against it. And that was an important moment, right? It showed that football associations, who, particularly in some countries where they stick to the letter of the law, should be looking at this in the context of the way it's being done, as a human rights gesture, as a gesture of positive anti-discrimination, as a message of inclusivity in many ways, and not to go around to sort of trying to sanction it or trying to stop it. And that's what happened. So there's been a lot of other interesting dynamics from the Premier League players and others taking the knee. And it's been really interesting watching that as it's kind of cascading around Europe.
Yeah, some really important points in there, Piara, and you know, certainly I'm sure we'll lead into the second part of the discussion around kind of what is the next sort of steps. But Dean, I want to come over to you as an organisation. I know you've been very vocal around the support of the players taking the knee, and as Piara sort of mentioned, you know, encouraging them to continue to do that. We have seen, as Piara mentioned, it starting to split some people's thoughts on whether they should, whether they shouldn't. I just wonder what your thoughts really are on that.
Yeah, I think we've heard a lot about whether people are going to take the knee, whether they're not going to take the knee. Then it started getting booed by some fans, which has then been replaced by applauding, by other fans showing their support. I think taking the knee, whether people aren't or they are, is still in people's mouths, and they're talking about racism, and they're talking about racial injustice and racial inequalities. And once you're talking about a subject, there's an opportunity to learn and educate yourself and others. So it's bringing that conversation to the forefront of people's mouths and giving everyone an opportunity where they can read up on it, educate themselves, but then also discuss with others. And I think you see a shift between active allies supporting Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities from subject to abuse. So no longer are people just standing by ignoring the racism. They're actually now thinking, well, I can stand up and I can challenge this. I think having positive role models like in the Premier League and through the EFL, and even in the Welsh Premier League and the women's game, the Adran leagues, I think it shows to young boys and girls that, you know, actually this is what your role models stand for, and they're more likely to follow suit if, you know, their favourite player they can see taking the knee and actually know what it stands for. And then across all the media outlets is obviously being talked about. You see on Sky Sports and Sky Sports News every time players are taking the knee, it's discussed and why they're doing it. So I think it's only a positive thing that it's constantly in people's mouths and actually discussing the reasons why these players are taking the knee. So we'd certainly support Faye, similar to Piara, can they do it for as long as possible and keep these conversations going?
I wonder, Piara, you mentioned earlier, I suppose, a shift to accountability, you mentioned, and you know, for governing bodies, football, sport, and even sort of beyond that across various industries, which I think has certainly been more on the forefront, I think, in the last 18 months, and rightly so. But I wonder, to play devil's advocate a little bit, that, you know, I certainly think that the taking the knee has had a huge impact, but taking the knee alone is not going to stop racism within the game. It's not going to provide solutions and challenge the status quo and what things have been and the way things have always been done within football. So I just wonder, Anita, kind of, you know, when does it stop? You know, what is the next stage, really, the next steps that we want to see? Because, as I said, by taking the knee, yes, it's continuing us having these discussions, but these discussions alone, and just players having that awareness, or wearing T-shirts, is not the solution and not going to change things as such longer term. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on, you know, what is the thing that we need? And I know it's a bit of $1 million question, but just want to know your thoughts really on it, Anita. Sorry, I don't know.
Well, I think this is a great question for Piara, actually, to answer first. You know, I can give my opinions on what I think should happen, but I think leadership starts from the top. So as long as, you know, FIFA and UEFA and big governing bodies start to impose, you know, harsher sanctions and bans and things like that on individuals as well, also including sort of a legal aspect where arrests and things like that can take place, it has more of a chance to have a long-lasting impact. So as a player, personally, I think the bans and sanctions are too lenient, and the fines, you know, are really not enough to have that sustainable impact. And often you're seeing clubs in Europe in particular where their fans have displayed anti-discriminatory behavior or racist messaging, banners and all of those kinds of things, are only getting short-term bans for maybe one behind closed door game, or, you know, I know there's up to 5 games they could potentially miss, but I think they need to think bigger, and they need to, you know, impose perhaps a whole season ban. You know, that's tough for a diehard supporter, I suppose, to deal with. And I think, you know, once they're able to show that kind of leadership from top down, will it allow and empower, you know, clubs, you know, international FAs to sort of impose more of their sanctions and punishments as well.
Yeah, I think I agree with Anita actually on that point about the inconsistency of sanctioning in international football. We work with those organisations, with UEFA and FIFA, and I would say that in the period I've been working with them, they go through cycles. They sometimes do really good, interesting work and sanction in a very brave way, and then other times they get caught up in the politics of football and the positioning around football, who's electing who, which FAs they need to keep on board, who are the big clubs, that type of thing. And there just isn't enough clarity on some of these issues. And I sometimes, you know, perhaps I'm too close to it, sometimes kind of understand that, but then you hear other people talk and you realize actually that for some of them, they do write off dealing with discrimination as a perennially difficult issue. And so their perspective is whatever we do will not be enough. So we just do what we can, when we can, incident by incident. And for many of us who are watching, that's not enough because there isn't enough consistency there. The sanctioning isn't enough. And I suppose a good example of that is what happened when Rangers played in Prague last Thursday, wasn't it? The Spartak had been sanctioned for racism the previous match against Monaco. There were ordered to play in an empty stadium, and yet they were also then allowed to bring in 10,000 children. And those 10,000 children booed a particular black player who had previously been racially abused by a player from the other team, Slavia Prague, the other team in Prague. So, you know, it was a mystery to us why those children were given permission to come in, because they may be children, they may be under 14, but they can also follow the attitudes of their parents, which is clearly what they did. So that inconsistency, I think you're right, should be at the top of the shopping list, that we want more consistency. Everybody should be showing their utmost in terms of their commitments to using sanctioning as a tool to change behavior. It does change behavior. There's a lot of people say you need to educate them. Often the sanctioning of a country or a club creates those internal debates that then leads to behavior change, that then gives a space for education to come in. The other question, I think, for me is what happens after the taking of the knee is, what are the issues that the players really want to push? Because if nothing else, you know, this has also come on top of a new period, I would say, of athlete activism. You know, it's not just the taking of the knee and the way that it's been led by players and the way that players have fought against the challenges to that is significant and relatively new, but it's also the way the players are now talking more openly. And I think this has started in the women's game. Women are far more open about, for example, their sexual orientation than men ever have been in the men's game. Women are far more open about the issues that concern them and speaking publicly about them. And the men in football have only recently caught up in this country. And then, you know, you look at the amazing work that Mark Rashford has done in feeding young kids. You look now at more and more players who are speaking out about different issues and doing it, you know, in a way in which relates to their own lives, which is then in a way that other people can follow. So I think it's in many ways a question for them. Where do you, because you are now not just footballers, you're not just athletes, you are leaders. Where do you want to go? What are the changes that you want to see? And I would say one of the things at the top of the list is to a better sharing of power, by which I mean more representation of those ethnic minority players, black players in particular. You know, it's I think Dean mentioned it earlier on. We just do not have enough black coaches in the UK. Every country that makes up the UK has a long history of black involvement within the playing side, but that is not reflected in leadership positions, whether it's coaching or administration. But coaching is the biggest gap, because that's what players do when they leave, when they hang up their boots, right? They do their coaching badges and then go into whether they become a first team coach, a technical director, or something else that's technical. And those opportunities historically just haven't been available to them. Now, the English FA are doing some stuff, and I know that you guys are doing some stuff around the pipeline in Wales. This stuff is not difficult. You know, it's been done in the corporate sector. I can tell you the stages that are needed in order to create that change. You know, how you make it easy for people to get qualified, how you give them confidence to apply for jobs, how you work on them personally to give them the confidence, how you break down the networks that are excluding them, how you then, yes, if need be, use positive action measures like the Rooney Rule in order to give them an opportunity. In the end, you do not get, I once was challenged by a fan who said, I don't want Delroy from the Dog and Duck managing my football team. I mean, it's such an outrageous, really racist suggestion. You just do not get professional football coaches, whether they're coaching the under 15s, the under 18s, or the first team, who cannot do that job. If they can't do the job, they're found out within minutes, right? It's just not that sort of place. If I can't run 100 meters very fast, you're going to find me out very quickly. So to suggest actually that having proactive measures in place, having a pipeline in place that brings people through is somehow gonna lessen the quality is very, very insulting. I see the English FA in particular doing this stuff around the national teams. They're making sure that they have a black coach with every age group. They're making sure also now through their leadership, the diversity leadership code, that the clubs are beginning to set targets and report on those targets. That's a bit early still to know what the impact will be. But that kind of positive action is at the heart of that. And I really do believe that it works. I've seen it work in the NFL. I've seen it worked in the corporate sector, and I really think it can work in football.
Yeah, certainly, and certainly some things that we're sort of currently working on as well in terms of similar principles, leadership mentoring programs as well. And to come back to your earlier point around the incident last week, I think that the scariest thing for me was, that was 10,000 young people. And as you said, certainly you've got the attitudes from adults. And, I think it just highlights, Dean, that the work that obviously SRtRC and the Red Card do in going into schools and educating young people is so important. And for me, I think education has always been such an important part. And Piara, you mentioned earlier that I think sanctions can play a big role in prevention and trying to impact some people if they're banned. And, Anita, you mentioned, could fans be banned for a season, for life? And I think education can play a key part in that. And it's one of the reasons why this season we've brought in that, for everyone at every level within the game, whether you're a junior or an adult, if you're sanctioned, it is a mandatory education element to that as well. Just again, try and use football as a tool to help enforce social change, but also trying to prevent and educate those within the game. But you sort of work with young people, Dean, on a weekly basis, and obviously deliver some of our educational sessions with clubs as well. For those sort of clubs listening in, what role can they play in trying to pass on some of these key messages, and again using football to educate their players in the hope that in time we have the right values and beliefs with our young players that are involved in the game in Wales? I
think education is key, and eradicating racism from society is important, because racism isn't a football problem; it's a societal problem. And football fans and players aren't just fans or players; they're part of society, and that's the bigger picture. It's just coming out at football. You see it with football being such high profile. This is why you see racism within football being highlighted in the media so much. But I think with young children and clubs, I think it's really important of being accepting people of a difference. So no matter why they're different or how they're different to you, but just being accepting and having a good culture at your club where if you are going to put something on social media about Christmas, can we celebrate all religious holidays? Can we educate ourselves about the different cultures? So, for example, if there are prayer times, can we adapt training times to make sure that we're catering for all the different religions within our club? And also speaking to our community and making sure our clubs represent the community they're in. As Anita spoke of earlier when she had a time at Arsenal, it's really important that grassroots clubs are part of that community, family clubs, and they're welcoming for everybody that wants to come. And sometimes that is treating people differently and reaching out to different communities and different individuals to come and try football, rather than going, oh, we tried and they didn't want to come. Well, I don't think that's enough. We have to be adaptable. We have to reach out, and we do have to treat people differently to make sure that we've got inclusive environment and that we're welcoming these individuals from different communities or different religions or cultures into our football clubs, and making sure they feel valued when they are there. I think that's really important. And for clubs, I would say educate yourself as much as you can. Reach out to SRtRC and Red Card, and we can certainly put on education workshops for coaches, for committee members, whatever your club needs, we can certainly try and address that and support you. Whether that's just sending out some fact sheets of how to make your club more inclusive, or that's having a full workshop for every single age group, we can certainly cater our support to each individual club, and make sure that football's for all. Part of it, though, I think as well, is media's got a huge part to play in this. The way they portray footballers like Raheem Sterling has been absolutely disgusting over the years. And, adding to that negative stereotypes of certain communities. But then Raheem Sterling now is using his platform to hit back and actually influence change. Like Piara talked about, Marcus Rashford, changing the government stance on free school meals during the holidays is absolutely unbelievable. And I think that's given the players even more power now to say, well, actually, let's use our being positive role models to actually make a difference in their communities and make a difference to certainly what they're they want to achieve and the issues they see. So I think we're in a really good place now where footballers feel inspired to make a difference through using their platform now. And I think that's across the men's and women's game. You know, we got Anita here, fantastic role model, and, you know, inspiring so many young girls coming up through the game to take part as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned education being so important, and obviously some of the work that yourselves do. And I suppose it's a good time to mention the next couple of weeks that you'll be delivering some educational sessions, workshops, more interactive sessions over the next one each week throughout the month of action. So, you know, anyone tuning in, make sure you keep an eye out for those. Some educational sessions on understanding what racism is a little bit more, but also how it can anti-racism can be embedded within your club as well. So Anita, Dean sort of highlighted the importance, I suppose, and the role that clubs can play. So you know, as a player yourself and coming on that journey from a young person playing at a grassroots club and working right the way up to the highest level in the women's game, I just wondered, like, what any advice that you would give for clubs and individuals listening in to challenge racism within their own club and within the game, but also how can they support an individual that might be experiencing racism themselves?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jason. I think first and foremost, you know, clubs should look at their own values and what they represent, you know, and how they are measuring up to the values that they say they represent and they're putting out publicly. You know, that's where they should start. You know, who do we want to be? What do we want to look like? Are we serving our wider community that's immediately around us? And how can we, you know, obviously there's a marketing and branding element to a lot of clubs as well, that they want to get greater exposure and get bigger fan bases. And the way to do that is to, you know, recognize, you know, what does your club look like? Is it diverse across different levels, you know, whether it be management, operations, to the playing group? Are you really exempt, you know, a good example of that? And then again with, you know, have they got the right measures in place to support players like myself and other players coming into the game from a sort of psychological and emotional standpoint? Because unfortunately, we know there are incidences of racism in football, and it may happen at different levels, at different age groups, but there aren't always the structural things in place to necessarily cater to the needs of those individuals in both reporting and being comfortable enough to tell you know, certain individuals within the coaching staff or within the structure of the club as a first point of contact before it goes beyond to, you know, the FAs and so on and so forth. So I just think it's really important that clubs really start to look at their sort of internal processes and what they look like. And when it comes to inclusive action, you know, the language they're using, you know, are you being inclusive with the language you're using, or is that a barrier to players or individuals who are representative across different intersections? Because like myself, you know, I represent Black women, but I also am part of the LGBTQ community. And I know that if I was around an environment that was very hostile and homophobic, that would have been, you know, an obstacle, a challenge that I would have found difficult to navigate. And then you put the context of age on top of that, where young people are developing and trying to find their own identities, you know, that becomes an even a more complex issue. So yeah, I just think it's very important that clubs are constantly evolving and reevaluating and seeing where they're at and how they can improve their environment to cater for all the needs of the individuals participating in their club. And just to add, I know we're talking about racism, but I know to see the progression of women and girls football and why that's happened has largely happened because clubs have now started to put the women and girls football agenda into the boardroom meetings. So it's not just about how they're evolving the men's game in terms of finance and, you know, branding and all of that, but they factor in women. So we can do the same on all issues, whether it's related to racism, sexuality, disability and invisible disabilities, for example. I think that's the next level. And that would be the ultimate goal of really, truly being inclusive.
Yeah, and I've made some really good points there, Anita. And, you know, I think that a lot of the principles you said cuts across all equality areas. And, you know, we've recently developed a club PAWB program, which is essentially a framework for clubs to look at becoming more diverse, representative of their own communities, but also inclusive and equal. And again, shifting towards that environment where everyone feels welcome and belong and can be part of. And the first session, I think it's November that we're rolling that one out. So, certainly looking forward to having clubs being part of that, and essentially will become mandatory in time, where every club will have an equality champion that will sort of be tasked with trying to achieve that at the smallest grassroots club right the way up to our Cymru Premier and Adran Premier clubs as well. So shifting over to some questions that we've had in. First question sort of in was around some clubs in the EFL have not condemned the booing of sort of taking a knee. Has this had a negative effect on the campaign? So Dean, I think this is targeted towards yourself. So you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what are your thoughts briefly on that one? Yeah,
it's a difficult one. I think that it should be condemned by EFL clubs, but some haven't, and some are still accepting it. I think a lot of clubs now are trying to get over that by having an applause. So a lot of people clapping during taking a knee. Again, I think it's just when this happens that clubs are still booing, it is then talked about even more. So it does have a negative effect in the aspect that the players who are taking the knee are hearing people booing them when they're doing it, and it's got a negative effect on them. But with the campaign of raising awareness and being on the edge of people's tongues talking about, why they're taking the knee, I think it's probably continuing those conversations happening. But I think, personally, individual clubs should come out and condemn it. I wouldn't know why you wouldn't. As a business point of view for a football club, in diverse communities, you want more people from all different communities to come to your club and buy season tickets, and you want the best players to play for your football club. And if they are Black, or if they are Asian, or they're from a different minority ethnic group, you want them playing for your club. If they hear people booing, taking a knee, they're not going to feel comfortable coming to the stadium or wanting to play for that club. So they may go and join a different club, or may go and join a different academy. So I think it has a negative impact on some of the individuals taking the knee. In the grand scheme of things, I think it's just continuous conversations that, it's in the press that said club, I won't name any, certainly their fans are booing the knee again, or, have continued to boo taking the knee. And again, it's still in those conversations.
And I think it kind of links in the point you were making there, Dean, with the next question. And somebody mentioned about sort of educating the fan base, those attending matches regularly. Any thoughts or suggestions on how clubs can educate their fans and also perhaps empower fans to be a positive influence? Which is a really good question. Piara, I don't know what your thoughts on that one. Yeah, you're on mute, Piara, just so you know.
Sorry, guys, I was reading all the fascinating questions, actually. I was actually also, if I can, just agree with Anita. Malk says, well said, Anita, and I agree. I think that one of the things, you sometimes see more overtly in the women's game from the outside is that it's a far more inclusive place. Right? And you have different things going on that for me, have a lot of potential. I'm really excited about women's football and where it could go as a sport in itself. Of course, it's linked. It is football. It's linked in many ways to men's football, but it is a sport in itself, right? And I'm really, really interested in that. Really been interested in some of the commercial developments that we've seen recently with commercial sponsors saying, we just want to sponsor women's football, not the rest of it. And then the way that the players are a lot more forthright, the way in which, the players are just seem more emotionally connected with the world. And I think for me, that's like one of the big areas that I'm looking out for. And then the education value that has, seeing women's sports role models there in the public domain does a lot for young people, I think. And it's certainly in their kind of imagining of the world, right? I think you still have to, if you look what's been happening in this country, in England in particular, in recent weeks, and you look at what's been happening in the NWSL, with abuse, my God, men need educating. And I think if we can start that as young as possible by revering women as role models, by celebrating their successes, then that's a good start. And I think in terms of education of clubs, there's so many good resources, right? There's the work that Show Us the Red Card do in Wales, Scotland, England. There's so many other resources, so many experts out there who take on the training of young players that can educate fans, that can run campaigns, mini campaigns for clubs. I think it's almost like one of those things that I hope is going to become very mandatory very soon. That every club needs to show what it's doing to educate its fan base, its local community in terms of diversity, because it's really easy for them to do that. It's cheap, it's quick. There's no reason why clubs shouldn't be getting involved. This is one of the things actually that, I'm often within a European context. The UK is known for often blowing its trumpet at times when it shouldn't. But I think that is one of the things where we can lead the way, right? Where we can say here in the UK, in the different countries, we're doing some interesting stuff in football that very few other countries are doing. And those that are doing it are inspired by what happens here. If you and I know, Jason, the most progressive countries in terms of football in Europe are probably the Dutch, the Belgians, the Germans, and the Scandinavians. Many of them are doing good stuff around diversity, inclusion, anti-discrimination, but they're often always looking here to see the sort of things that people like you are doing, seeing what the English FA are doing and others. And I think that really gives us an opportunity here to kind of almost set the course of the future for football for the rest of Europe. It's something that we do in a leadership way. Others are following. Let's really show them what's possible from the top all the way down to the grassroots.
Thanks, Piara. And to finish off on a question that hopefully finish off on a positive and shifting towards some of the impact that the work, the discussions that we're having, and some of the actions can have. Someone's noted around after England's success at the Euros, there was a lot of discourse around ethnic minorities finally feeling proud to be English after years of trauma surrounding that status in terms of English versus British. Are you aware of a similar struggle for identity with ethnic minorities in Wales? I will pass over to Dean in a second, but I had the privilege recently of being involved with launching Amar Cymru, which is our South Asian supporters group, and hearing some of the experiences, in previous times of some of the people that were part of that and a part of Amar Cymru, was quite sad to hear. But having heard, some of the more positive experiences and actually what Wales football means to them, and actually that feeling of very proudly being Welsh and following the Wales team, I think a lot of the more positive stuff that's been happening, has helped and shifted towards a similar experience, I think. And Dean, hopefully you agree with that, but that's certainly the case in recent discussions I've had.
Yeah, definitely. I was lucky enough to attend the launch at Amar Cymru, and since then worked with Cardiff City and Swansea City, where we're looking to set up some South Asian fan groups in those two clubs. Newport County already have got Exiles Together, which is a fan group there. And there's a little bit of work to be done up in Wrexham as well, working with the professional clubs. I think there has been a overarching negative kind of stance where football wasn't always inclusive, and some older people in the communities, South Asian, Black community, where they don't want their children going to football matches in case they experience the same racism they did when they were younger. Example, this is if my line manager at Show Us the Red Card had a really negative experience when he was 8 at Cardiff City. Since then, he's gone back, he's got a season ticket and takes his boys down to Cardiff City for his sins, going and watching them every week. But certainly it's a much better experience now. So I think it's kind of breaking down those barriers now, where there are more people from ethnic communities, minority ethnic communities attending not just Wales games, but certainly Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, Wrexham, and are feeling more valued and comfortable going to those. And then certainly that's rolling over then into kind of the Welsh League and the Adam Premier Leagues as well, where you're getting more, you know, people of colour attending these fixtures as well. So I think it's still got a long way to go, but we are starting to see the difference where we are getting more of these individuals coming to games, and certainly getting their own little group together of people similar to them, where they can go and attend the game, and whether that be that they find somewhere to go first of all, where we were lucky enough, we went to the Jew Barrage in Rubina, which was absolutely amazing food, but finding their own little kind of clique where they'll go and meet somewhere and then they'll go to the game together. And I think it's a lot of positive steps going forward, a lot more work to be done, but it's certainly moving forward.
Brilliant, thanks, Dean. So we're just coming towards the end of the session. I just wanted to say thank you to Anita, Piara and Dean for joining us tonight. And again, just to reiterate that, yes, we're having a discussion here, but I think we all agree that the key point out of tonight is that the Taking the Knee has continued to generate this discussion, and quite possibly in recent times, 18 months later, we might not have been having this discussion. So that's definitely a positive thing, but it's certainly not something that is going to stop racism. And I think the actions, and for everyone that's on the call tonight that has a role to play within the football family in Wales, you know, has a responsibility to do their own part in trying to challenge that within their own social circles and their own club as well. And, you know, while we can lead from the top as a Football Association of Wales, as a governing body, you know, we can't do it without all of our members and everyone across the football family joining us and doing their own thing as well, and trying to focus on action. So, you know, please get involved in the rest of the educational sessions during this month, and also check out some of our wider PAWB education programs, and as I said, the Club PAWB program that we'll be rolling out soon as well, trying to provide more resources and support for everyone, whatever level you're at within Wales, in becoming more of an equal, diverse and inclusive club, to try and create that environment again where football is a place that everyone can take part, and is for all at all times. So thank you ever so much, and thanks for everyone that tuned in tonight. Hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. And if you haven't done so already, please sign up to our month of action as a grassroots club. I'm sure Jason will be able to share some of the details with you following this. And please sign up, and we'd love to see more and more clubs supporting the campaign.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Ciao.